Few symbols convey the mysteries of ancient consciousness more potently than the Great Sphinx of Giza. Just south of the Great Pyramid on the west bank of the Nile River, this mythical limestone creature has the body of a lion and the head of a human. The Sphinx is the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt. According to mainstream scholars, it was built by ancient Egyptians during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre between the dates 2558 and 2532 BC. But in 1992, author and independent Egyptologist John Anthony West claimed that the Great Sphinx of Giza was not carved in 2500 BC, but 9,000 to 10,000 years earlier, before Egypt was a desert, and even before the dawn of man as we know it. While studying the works of 1920s scholar Schwaller de Lubitz, John Anthony West discovered that conventional Egyptologists had overlooked an important detail. The body of the Sphinx bore distinct markings of water erosion. If it was water erosion, then the entire history of ancient man would have to be rewritten. The conversation was a controversial subject the Oxford geologists didn't want to get involved with. This did little to deter John West from wanting to solve the mystery. If the Great Sphinx of Egypt was built thousands of years earlier than was written in mainstream history, could the water erosion marks he'd examined shed new light on the creation of the human race? Determined to find out, John sought other scientists willing to join his quest. His search led him to Professor Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University.
I first went to see the Sphinx in 1990, and I noticed immediately that there was a disconnect because the weathering and erosion that I saw on the Sphinx was not compatible with Sahara desert hyper-arid conditions. What I was seeing, I was convinced, was precipitation weathering and erosion from rainfall, from water beating down on it. Now, how do you have that when it's been Sahara desert for 5,000 or more years? So immediately I saw this anomaly, and the logical conclusion I had, again, virtually immediately, was that the Sphinx must go back to an earlier climatic regime.
Can the water erosion marks that John West discovered stand alone to prove the Sphinx was constructed before 2500 BC? In 2008, geoarchaeologists Manischev and Parkhomenko argued that through their research of the analyzation of erosion on the Sphinx, they figured it actually was part of a civilization much older.
Two Ukrainian geologists believe that the Sphinx, which is on the edge of the plateau at Giza, could be as much as 800,000 years old. Why do they believe this? What they propose is that originally the Mediterranean Sea extended all the way to the plateau of Giza and lapped up against the Sphinx to create the distinctive weathering patterns that we see. I think that they could be right about the weathering, but I think that we're talking about the Sphinx before it was actually carved into what we see today. There was a rocky promontory or knoll at that site, which obviously was later used to carve the Sphinx, and that would have had weathering patterns on it. And almost certainly that does date back hundreds of thousands of years and could well have been weathered by water at some point in the past. But certainly that was not in the recent past.
As theories about how old the Sphinx is continue, Robert Schoch has found his research keeps leading him back in time. Since he first traveled to Giza in 1992, Professor Robert Schoch's research has taken his first dating of the Sphinx even further. His most recent geological and seismic findings have convinced him that the Great Sphinx could have been carved as far back as 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age.
We know geologically and from studies of ancient climatology that prior to about 3,000, what is now Sahara was much more moist, much more temperate, much more rainfall. So I concluded that I had to go back at least to that earlier period. My initial estimate was 5,000 to 7,000 BC. This was very, very radical at the time. The Egyptologists were livid about this. They were saying all kinds of nasty things about me, calling me a pseudoscientist because they said this was absolutely impossible because there's no civilization when you go back to 5,000 to 7,000 BC that could construct the Sphinx. Since then, I've continued my studies. I've carried on with this. I've actually reanalyzed the seismic data, and I'm convinced at this point, for a number of technical reasons, that actually the seismic data suggests that we have to go back to at least around 10,000 BC. And this also fits much better the climatic regime and gives enough time for the erosion and weathering that we're seeing.
When could the Sphinx have been exposed to what turns out, what needs to have been about 1,000 years of very heavy rainfall? But there was no rainfall like that in Egypt in the time of the pharaohs either. The Giza Plateau was as dry 4,500 years ago as it is today. And yet here is a structure that has been heavily weathered by rainfall, which has fallen on it for a long period of time. You have to go back, more than 11,500 years. You have to go back to 12,000 years, really, to get the kind of climate conditions in that part of the Sahara that would have been capable of causing that level of erosion on the Sphinx. The rainfall erosion is most visible on the trench that surrounds the Sphinx. Nobody bothered to restore that. And there you can see this undulating profile and cuts through it. It's classic rainfall-induced weathering. And the Sphinx's body has been repaired again and again down the journey. It wasn't just in the Old Kingdom it was repaired. There were more repairs done in the New Kingdom as well. And right down into more recent times, they're still restoring the core body of the Sphinx today. This alone should have alerted archaeologists to the fact that there's a problem, because some of the most extensive restorations of the Sphinx, when blocks were applied to that rock-hewn core body of the Sphinx to repair damage, some of those date from the Old Kingdom. They date from 2,500 BC. Now, if you made your Sphinx in 2,500 BC, what on earth are you doing restoring it massively in 2000? It should be pristine.
Greg Braden adds another layer to the dating of the Sphinx.
When we look at the mystery of the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau and the traditional dating of only 4,000 years, where that no longer makes sense is the erosion on the Sphinx has now been proven by Robert Schoch to be fluvial erosion rather than aeolian erosion. And fluvial means vast amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time, where aeolian erosion would be wind blowing and eroding over long periods of time. Robert Schoch showed beyond any reasonable doubt that it is water erosion that has created the Sphinx. His findings were accepted by AAPG, the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. They looked at the evidence and they said, of course, this makes perfect sense. We have no problem with this. The historians have a huge problem, because the last time there were vast amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time is when the ice melted from the last ice age, and that is now being dated in that part of Egypt between 7,000 and 9,000 years before present. So I think the evidence strongly supports that the Sphinx was in place when that water was melting. What it doesn't account for is the ice age was there for 20,000 years. Was the Sphinx built before the ice happened and subject to the erosion, or was the Sphinx built while the ice was in place? And we don't know the answer to that yet.
Some researchers suggest that the Sphinx could have been built during the precessional cycle, even before the current one, giving it the date of 36,000 BC.
John Anthony West's view is that actually it's not marking 12,500 years ago. It's marking the precessional cycle before that, the previous age of Leo, which would be 25,920 years before that. The age of Leo recurs every 25,920 years. So the astronomy doesn't absolutely commit us to the date of 12,500 years ago, but what does, I think, commit us to the date of 12,500 years ago is the geology, the way that the Sphinx is measured, and the fact that that was a very rainy period in Egypt. If you wind back the ancient skies to 10,500 BC, you go over to Giza and you find that two constellations are modeled on the ground there. One is the constellation of Orion, the belt stars of Orion in the positioning of the three Great Pyramids, and the other is the constellation of Leo with the Great Sphinx gazing due east. And the strangest thing is that you again get a lock, not in 2,500 BC when Giza is supposed to have been created. None of it works then. You have to go back 12,500 years to 10,500 BC to get Leo locking perfectly with the Sphinx at dawn on the spring equinox. It's the age of Leo. It's as though the lion-bodied Sphinx is looking at its own celestial counterpart in the sky. And the constellation of Orion due south on the meridian in exactly the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground. And that only happens 12,500 years ago.
Could the Sphinx and the pyramids have been built at the same time? If so, could the ancient civilization that built it be marking a very important time for our current human race?
Now, with modern computer software, we can look at the ancient skies in any period we wish. It's interesting when we switch from geology to astronomy, and we start looking at the Sphinx and the pyramids as astronomically connected monuments. And we can't do otherwise, because the Sphinx, as I mentioned, is perfectly aligned on due east. Perfect. That's the work of people who are studying the sky.
If you liked this video and you want to see more amazing content, go ahead and check out the next video on our channel.